I saw an orange Datsun sedan with black letters and strips at the bottom. It was double parked in front of my house, and about 2 minutes later, I came out of my house and the children were coming down the street saying that Lori was in that car.
On the afternoon of August 22, 1983, life in Sheridan, Colorado, looked exactly the way residents had always known it. It was a small community just south of Denver, where neighbors recognized each other by name. Children spent their afternoons outside, and parents rarely felt the need to worry when their kids played. It was the kind of neighborhood where people still believed nothing truly terrible could happen in broad daylight. For Richard and Diane Poland, it was an ordinary Monday. Richard was outside painting the family home while their 3-year-old daughter, Lori, played nearby with her 5-year-old brother. The children remained within sight as Richard worked, and from where he stood, he could occasionally glance over to make sure everything was fine. Lori had recently turned 3 years old, and like most children her age, her attention shifted quickly from one thing to another. She was energetic, curious, and happy to spend the afternoon outside while her father worked. As the afternoon grew warmer, Lori asked her father for a popsicle. Richard stepped inside the house to get one. It was something that should have taken less than a minute. Before turning away from the window, he could still see both children outside. Nothing appeared unusual. He opened the freezer, reached inside, and then walked back toward the front door. When he stepped outside again, Lori was gone. At first, Richard didn't panic. Children sometimes wandered into the backyard or around the side of the house without saying anything. He called Lori's name, expecting her to appear from behind a tree or answer from somewhere nearby. Instead, he found his young son standing alone. Then he noticed something lying near the curb: Lori's pants. For a brief moment, it didn't make sense. Her clothing shouldn't have been there, and Lori certainly wouldn't have taken them off herself before wandering away. The sight immediately transformed a confusing situation into something far more frightening. Richard began calling her name louder, searching around the property while neighbors noticed the growing concern and came outside to help. As more people joined the search, one neighbor shared a detail that immediately caught everyone's attention. Only moments earlier, a vehicle had briefly stopped in front of the Poland home before driving away. At the time, it hadn't seemed unusual enough to remember, but now, with Lori missing, it suddenly became the most important piece of information anyone had. Richard wasted no time contacting the police. Within minutes, officers from the Sheridan Police Department arrived at the neighborhood. They quickly realized they weren't dealing with a child who had simply wandered off. The circumstances suggested something much more serious. A 3-year-old had disappeared within seconds while playing directly outside her own home. If someone had taken her, every passing minute reduced the chances of finding her quickly. Search efforts expanded almost immediately. Officers began canvassing nearby streets, knocking on doors, and speaking with anyone who might have seen a suspicious vehicle or unfamiliar person in the area. Volunteers from the community joined the search, checking parks, vacant lots, drainage ditches, and nearby fields. As word spread across Sheridan, more people arrived to help. Parents brought their own children inside, while others walked block after block, hoping to find some sign of Lori. For Richard and Diane, the hours passed in a blur. Every police radio transmission, every phone call, and every approaching vehicle brought a momentary sense of hope that disappeared just as quickly. There was still no indication of where Lori had gone or who might have taken her. The following hours became a race against time. Investigators knew that the first day of a child abduction is often the most critical. They documented every possible clue, collected witness statements, and worked to establish a timeline of Lori's disappearance. One witness provided investigators with valuable information about the vehicle seen near the Poland residence. Another family came forward, after realizing they had experienced a disturbing encounter only days earlier. Their children had been approached by an unfamiliar man under circumstances that now seemed impossible to ignore. At first, these incidents appeared unrelated. Sheridan was a quiet town, and isolated reports of suspicious behavior didn't always point to a larger pattern. But as detectives compared the statements, similarities began to emerge. Multiple witnesses described a man approaching young children in different parts of the community within a relatively short period of time. Each report seemed insignificant on its own. Together, they suggested something far more alarming. Investigators began considering the possibility that Lori's disappearance had not been a random crime of opportunity. Instead, someone may have been driving through the area for days, watching neighborhoods, approaching children, and waiting for the right moment to act. Meanwhile, Richard and Diane faced every parent's worst nightmare. With no answers from investigators and no contact from whoever had taken their daughter, there was little they could do except hope that Lori was still alive. As the first day came to an end, they turned to the media, asking for help from anyone who might know something about their daughter's disappearance. Standing before television cameras, they pleaded for her safe return, hoping that someone, somewhere, had seen the vehicle or recognized the man responsible. While the public watched those emotional appeals, detectives continued following every lead they could find. The witness descriptions were becoming more consistent, and attention slowly began focusing on one possible suspect. Yet, identifying a suspect and proving a crime are two very different things. At that moment, investigators still didn't know where Lori was. More importantly, they had no way of knowing whether she was still alive. Chapter 2: A Community Under Suspicion. As the first night came to an end, investigators knew they were no longer searching for a missing child who had wandered away from home. Every piece of evidence pointed toward an abduction. Lori had disappeared in a matter of seconds from the front yard of her family's home, leaving behind only a small pair of pants and a growing list of unanswered questions. The urgency of the investigation increased with every passing hour because detectives understood that, in cases involving very young children, time was often the deciding factor between rescue and tragedy. The following morning, Sheridan police were joined by additional investigators, and before long, the FBI became involved in the search. Roadblocks were established. Officers continued canvassing neighborhoods, and investigators interviewed anyone who might have seen a suspicious vehicle during the afternoon Lori disappeared. Hundreds of tips began coming in from across the Denver metropolitan area, but like many high-profile missing child cases, most of them led nowhere. Every phone call had to be investigated, every reported sighting had to be verified, and every possible lead consumed valuable time. Despite the growing number of tips, two witness statements quickly stood out. One came from a local resident named Paul Weaver, who had paid close attention to the vehicle seen near the Poland home. While many witnesses struggled to remember details during stressful situations, Weaver was able to provide investigators with a description of the car that was far more specific than anyone else had. Detectives believed his observations could become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. Around the same time, another resident, Michael R. Fisher, contacted police after realizing something that had happened to his own children only days earlier might be connected to Lori's disappearance. According to Fisher, an unfamiliar man had approached his children during the previous week. At the time, the incident had been unsettling, but there was no indication that a crime had been committed. After hearing about Lori's disappearance on the news, however, the encounter suddenly took on a far more sinister meaning. As detectives continued interviewing witnesses, they discovered that Fisher's family wasn't alone. Several children from different parts of the community described remarkably similar encounters with the same man. Although the details varied slightly from one account to another, investigators noticed a disturbing pattern. The man appeared to be driving around residential neighborhoods, approaching young children when they were alone or only briefly separated from adults. In more than one case, he reportedly tried to gain their trust by offering candy before behaving in a way that alarmed the children enough for them to leave. Each report had originally seemed isolated. Together, they painted a picture of someone who had likely been searching for an opportunity long before Lori disappeared. For detectives, that realization changed the direction of the investigation. If the same individual had approached multiple children over the course of several days, then Lori's kidnapping may not have been a spontaneous act at all. It suggested planning, patience, and a willingness to repeatedly place himself near children until the circumstances were exactly right. Investigators began comparing every witness statement, every vehicle description, and every detail they had collected since Lori vanished. Slowly, one name began appearing at the center of the investigation. The vehicle described by witnesses matched one owned by a local groundskeeper named Robert Paul Thiret. Running the vehicle registration confirmed that the license plate belonged to him, placing investigators closer than ever to identifying the man they believed had taken Lori. Until that moment, they had been chasing descriptions. Now, they had a name, an address, and someone they could question. Detectives immediately began looking into Thiret's background. What surprised them was that there appeared to be very little to find. He had no significant criminal record. There was nothing in his history that immediately explained why multiple families were now describing encounters between him and their children. If the witness accounts were accurate, investigators were left wondering whether this behavior had only recently begun or whether previous victims had simply never been identified. Police located Thiret and questioned him, but they faced a serious legal problem. Suspicion alone wasn't enough to make an arrest. Although witnesses had connected his vehicle to several encounters involving children, detectives still had no physical evidence proving he had kidnapped Lori. More importantly, they still had no idea where she was. Without evidence tying him directly to the crime, investigators could do little more than continue questioning him while searching for additional proof. The investigation soon expanded to include people closest to Thiret. Officers interviewed members of his family, hoping someone might reveal information about his recent movements or behavior. They spoke with his mother and explained why they believed her son had become the focus of a major child abduction investigation. According to detectives, his car had now been connected to several separate incidents involving young children in the days leading up to Lori's disappearance. While investigators followed every lead available to them, Richard and Diane Poland endured another agonizing day without answers. TV cameras returned as reporters continued covering the search. Once again, Lori's parents appealed directly to the public, asking anyone with information to come forward. Their message remained heartbreakingly simple. If someone knew where their daughter was, they begged them to help bring her home safely. Behind the scenes, however, detectives were becoming increasingly frustrated. They believed they were closing in on the man responsible. They had searched locations connected to him. They had questioned family members. They had examined his vehicle. Yet they still couldn't find the one thing that mattered most: Lori. As another day passed, the possibility that she was still alive became harder for many people to believe. Investigators understood that every hour without a breakthrough reduced the chances of a successful rescue. But despite the growing sense of urgency, no one was prepared for what was about to happen nearly 40 miles away in the Colorado foothills. A chance decision made by a couple on an afternoon picnic was about to change the entire investigation. Chapter 3: The Discovery. By the morning of August 25th, the search for Lori Poland had entered its third day. Across Sheridan and the surrounding Denver area, investigators continued following every lead they received. Search teams checked open fields, wooded areas, abandoned buildings, and drainage canals. Detectives were still focused on Robert Paul Thiret, but despite interviewing him, searching locations connected to him, and speaking with members of his family, they still had nothing that could tell them where Lori was. Without that answer, every hour became more critical. For Richard and Diane Poland, the uncertainty had become almost unbearable. The family's routine had disappeared completely. Their home, once filled with toys and the sounds of two young children playing together, had become the center of an investigation that was attracting statewide attention. Reporters remained outside. Volunteers continued searching, and police officers came and went throughout the day. Yet despite the constant activity, there was still no news that brought them any closer to finding their daughter. At the same time, nearly 40 miles west of Sheridan, another ordinary day was unfolding. Steve and Cynthia Golan had planned to spend the morning birdwatching in the Colorado foothills before enjoying a picnic together. They had visited the mountains many times before, appreciating the quiet trails and peaceful scenery that drew hikers and nature enthusiasts to the area. Nothing about the trip suggested they were about to become part of one of Colorado's most remarkable rescue stories. As they drove through the foothills, Cynthia mentioned that she needed to use a restroom. Steve remembered an old trailhead near Beaver Brook where an abandoned outhouse still stood. It wasn't much, but it was the only place nearby that offered any privacy. So they turned off the road and parked near the weathered wooden structure. When Cynthia stepped inside, she immediately noticed something unusual. At first, she thought she had imagined it. Then she heard it again. A faint cry. It wasn't loud enough to identify immediately, but it was unmistakably human. She stopped and listened. The sound came once more. This time, she could make out a child's voice. She quickly called for Steve. Together, they searched around the small building, expecting to find a child somewhere outside. Instead, the cries seemed to be coming from directly beneath them. Looking down through the opening in the abandoned toilet, they were met with a sight neither of them would ever forget. At the bottom of the 10-foot deep sewage pit was a little girl. She was alive, she was covered in waste, and she was looking back up at them. Steve immediately spoke to her, trying to understand what he was seeing. He asked if she wanted help. The little girl quietly answered that she did. Emergency services were called without delay, and within a short time, sheriff's deputies, firefighters, and rescue personnel arrived at the trailhead. News of the discovery spread rapidly among officers already working on Lori's disappearance. Could this child possibly be the little girl they had spent 3 days searching for? Volunteer firefighter Stephen Baker was among those who responded to the scene. After assessing the situation, he was lowered into the narrow pit using a safety harness. The conditions were unlike anything he had experienced before. The confined space was filled with foul-smelling sludge, contaminated water, and years of accumulated waste. Despite the environment, the child remained conscious. She was frightened, exhausted, but alive. Baker carefully reached the little girl and examined her as best he could before beginning the rescue. He noticed that her legs had suffered severe injuries after several days inside the pit. Even so, she remained remarkably calm considering what she had endured. After securing her to the rescue harness, he slowly guided her back to the surface, where emergency medical personnel were waiting. The child was immediately transported to the hospital. Before long, investigators confirmed what many had scarcely dared to hope. The girl rescued from the abandoned outhouse was 3-year-old Lori Poland. For the first time since her disappearance, Richard and Diane finally knew that their daughter had survived. But relief quickly gave way to a new set of concerns. Doctors examining Lori discovered that her ordeal had left her in extremely serious condition. After spending nearly 4 days trapped inside the contaminated pit without food or water, her body showed signs of severe dehydration and infection. Her legs had suffered extensive damage, and physicians feared the infection was spreading rapidly. Her physical condition alone was life-threatening. Emotionally, Lori was just as fragile. Family members expected that seeing her parents again might comfort her, but the trauma she had experienced had left her withdrawn and fearful. According to those caring for her, she appeared disconnected from her surroundings and struggled to recognize or respond to the people trying to help her. Even after being reunited with her family, she remained trapped in a state of overwhelming psychological shock. While doctors worked to stabilize Lori's condition, detectives faced another challenge. Finding her alive answered one question, but it raised many others. Who had taken her? What had happened during the 4 days she was missing? And most importantly, could investigators finally gather enough evidence to hold the man they suspected responsible accountable? For the moment, only one person knew the answers. But at just 3 years old, Lori was too traumatized to explain what had happened. Investigators realized they would need patience because the memories they desperately needed were buried beneath days of fear, pain, and unimaginable trauma. Chapter 4: Remembering the Unthinkable. Lori's rescue marked a turning point in the investigation, but it did not bring immediate answers. After nearly 4 days trapped inside the abandoned outhouse, she was rushed to the hospital, where doctors focused on stabilizing her condition. She was severely dehydrated, exhausted, and suffering from extensive infections in both legs after spending days exposed to contaminated water and waste. The medical team was concerned that the infection had spread so rapidly that amputation might be the only way to save her life. At the same time, her emotional condition worried them just as much as her physical injuries. She was frightened, withdrawn, and showed signs of severe psychological trauma. For investigators, Lori represented the only eyewitness to the crime. Every lead they had followed pointed toward Robert Paul Thiret, but suspicion alone was not enough to secure a conviction. They needed evidence that connected him directly to Lori's kidnapping, and the only person who had been with her abductor was a 3-year-old child who could barely understand what had happened. Rather than questioning Lori immediately, doctors and child specialists agreed that her recovery had to come first. They understood that forcing a traumatized child to relive painful memories too soon could cause even greater psychological harm. Instead, they focused on helping her feel safe again, allowing her to rest while carefully observing how she responded to familiar people and surroundings. One of the physicians involved in Lori's treatment was Dr. Richard Krugman, a pediatrician experienced in caring for abused and traumatized children. As Lori slowly became stronger, he worked patiently to build her trust. There were no aggressive interviews or repeated questioning sessions. Instead, conversations happened gradually, allowing Lori to describe events in her own words whenever she felt ready. Over the course of nearly 2 weeks, fragments of Lori's memory began returning. At first, they were incomplete. She remembered small details without understanding how they fit together. As those memories slowly became clearer, investigators started piecing together a timeline of what had happened after she disappeared from her front yard. According to Lori's recollection, a man had stopped near her home and offered her candy. At only 3 years old, she had no reason to believe he intended to harm her. Like many children, she responded to what seemed like a harmless gesture from an adult. Within moments, she had been taken away from the neighborhood where she had been playing only seconds earlier. Investigators believed the man understood how much risk he had taken by abducting a child in broad daylight. Rather than remaining anywhere near Sheridan, he drove west toward the mountains, eventually arriving at an abandoned outhouse hidden deep in the Colorado foothills, isolated from nearby roads and surrounded by dense forest. It was a place few people had reason to visit. What happened there would remain one of the most disturbing parts of Lori's account. After assaulting her, the man lifted the 3-year-old child and dropped her through the opening of the abandoned toilet into the pit below. The fall left her injured, and in complete darkness she found herself surrounded by contaminated water and waste with no possible way to climb back out. When the door above finally closed, she was completely alone. Despite her age, Lori quickly realized that remaining in the water made her injuries worse. Feeling around in the darkness, she discovered a small mound of wood and debris rising just above the surface. It became the only place where she could keep part of her body out of the contaminated water. The space was so small that she couldn't fit entirely on top of it, forcing her injured legs to remain dangerously close to the sewage below. Years later, Lori would explain that she had no sense of time while trapped underground. There was no daylight, no way to distinguish morning from night, and no indication of how long she had been there. Hunger, exhaustion, and pain gradually replaced any understanding of time. She remembered crying for her mother repeatedly, hoping someone might hear her voice, but after days alone, the pit itself had become her entire world. When rescuers eventually found her and asked what she was doing there, she answered, "I live here," because in her mind, that dark hole had become her new reality. As Lori continued describing her ordeal, investigators realized something they had not fully understood before. This had not simply been a kidnapping. The evidence suggested that whoever abandoned Lori inside the outhouse expected her to die there, hidden beneath layers of waste, far from nearby roads, and unable to climb out on her own. She was never supposed to be found. Her survival depended entirely on a chance decision by two strangers who happened to stop at the abandoned trailhead days later. For detectives, Lori's memories became the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Although her age made the investigation unusually complicated, her account helped explain exactly what had happened after she disappeared and strengthened the case investigators were building against Robert Paul Thiret. Now, for the first time since Lori vanished, prosecutors believed they finally had enough evidence to move the case toward trial. But the legal battle that followed would leave Lori's family with a very different understanding of justice. Chapter 5: The Case Against Robert Thiret. As Lori's condition slowly improved, investigators finally had the information they had been searching for since the day she disappeared. The account she shared with Dr. Richard Krugman and other members of her medical team helped detectives understand what had happened after she was taken from her family's front yard. It also reinforced what many investigators had suspected from the beginning, that Robert Paul Thiret was responsible for Lori's kidnapping. Although Lori was only 3 years old, detectives believed her recollections matched the physical evidence and witness statements they had already collected. The descriptions provided by neighborhood witnesses, the reports from families whose children had been approached before Lori's disappearance, and the timeline investigators had reconstructed all pointed in the same direction. After days of uncertainty, the investigation was finally beginning to come together. Before prosecutors could move forward, however, investigators needed Lori to do one more difficult thing. She would be asked to identify the man responsible. Arrangements were made for a police lineup. Detectives understood the sensitivity of asking such a young child to participate, but they also knew that her identification could become one of the most important pieces of evidence presented in court. When the lineup took place, Lori carefully looked at the men standing before her. According to those who witnessed the moment, she reacted almost immediately. She recognized Robert Paul Thiret, rather than pointing confidently the way an adult witness might. Lori instinctively moved closer to her mother and pulled back in fear. Those present later recalled that her body language said as much as her words. She knew exactly who had hurt her, and seeing him again brought back the terror she had experienced only weeks earlier. For detectives, the identification was a major breakthrough. It strengthened the case they had spent days building and gave prosecutors additional confidence that they could move forward with criminal charges. Yet even with Lori's identification, the legal process remained far from straightforward. As preparations for trial began, investigators learned that Thiret intended to maintain his innocence, complicating matters further. His wife provided him with an alibi that supported his claim that he had not committed the crime. Whether that alibi would ultimately withstand scrutiny remained uncertain, but prosecutors recognized that it introduced a level of risk they could not ignore. A lengthy trial involving a 3-year-old victim, limited physical evidence, and conflicting testimony carried no guarantee of conviction. Faced with those challenges, discussions turned toward a plea agreement. The decision would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. Rather than proceeding to trial on every possible charge, prosecutors accepted a plea that significantly reduced Thiret's potential sentence. Several of the most serious charges were dismissed as part of the agreement, allowing the case to conclude without forcing Lori to testify in open court. While the arrangement ensured that Thiret would be sent to prison, it also meant he would receive far less time than many investigators and members of the public believed his crimes deserved. Ultimately, Robert Paul Thiret was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Even that sentence would not be served in full. After approximately 6 years, he was released for good behavior. For the Poland family, the outcome was difficult to accept. After everything Lori had endured, her kidnapping, the assault, the days trapped underground, and the months of recovery, the sentence felt painfully short. Many people who had followed the case shared that feeling, questioning whether justice had truly been served. Yet, while the legal proceedings came to an end, Lori's recovery was only beginning. The physical injuries she suffered gradually healed, far exceeding doctors' expectations. At one point, physicians feared that the infection in her legs would require amputation to save her life. Remarkably, that outcome never became necessary. Through intensive medical care and an extraordinary recovery, Lori regained her health without losing either leg. For everyone involved in her treatment, it was an outcome few had believed possible. When she first arrived at the hospital, the emotional wounds, however, would take much longer to heal. As Lori grew older, she experienced many of the lasting effects commonly associated with severe childhood trauma. Depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, difficulties with trust, and struggles with self-esteem became part of her life. These challenges did not disappear once the headlines faded or the court case ended. Instead, they followed her into adolescence and adulthood, shaping many of the experiences that came afterward. Despite those struggles, Lori's story did not end with the courtroom. In the years that followed, she made a decision that surprised many people who knew what she had survived. Rather than allowing the trauma to define the rest of her life, she chose to build a future centered on helping others who had experienced abuse. It was a path that transformed one of Colorado's most heartbreaking child abduction cases into a story of resilience, healing, and hope. Chapter 6: Rebuilding a Life. For most people following the case, the story seemed to end when Robert Paul Thiret was sentenced. The headlines gradually disappeared. Television crews moved on to other stories, and public attention shifted elsewhere. But for Lori Poland and her family, life would never simply return to the way it had been before August 1983. The kidnapping lasted only a few days. Its effects would last for decades. As Lori grew older, she faced challenges that many survivors of childhood trauma know all too well. The memories of what happened in the Colorado foothills didn't disappear simply because the investigation had ended. She struggled with anxiety, periods of depression, and the lasting effects of post-traumatic stress. Trusting people became difficult, and like many survivors, she often questioned her own sense of safety and security. These weren't obstacles that could be overcome overnight. They became part of the long process of learning how to live after experiencing something unimaginable at such a young age. Fortunately, Lori was surrounded by people who believed recovery was possible. Her parents remained a constant source of support throughout her childhood, and she continued receiving professional counseling as she grew older. Those around her understood that healing from trauma wasn't about forgetting what had happened. Instead, it meant learning how to move forward without allowing the experience to define every part of her life. Over time, that support helped Lori begin rebuilding the confidence and stability that had been taken from her years earlier. As she entered adulthood, Lori found herself thinking differently about the events that had shaped her childhood. Understandably, many people wanted to know whether she believed justice had been served. After all, the man responsible for kidnapping her had received a sentence that many considered far too lenient. Her answer surprised many people. Rather than focusing entirely on punishment, Lori spoke about something else. She explained that what mattered most to her was making a positive difference in the lives of other people. Every day, she tried to live in a way that would help prevent others from experiencing the same kind of suffering she had endured. It wasn't that she dismissed the seriousness of the crime or excused the man responsible. Instead, she chose not to let anger become the defining force in her own life. That outlook began influencing the direction of her future. She had dedicated herself to helping children who had experienced abuse and trauma. Drawing from her own experiences, she worked with young people facing circumstances similar to those she had survived years earlier. Her ability to understand their fears and emotions allowed her to connect with them in ways few others could. She became living proof that surviving trauma did not mean a person was destined to remain defined by it forever. When speaking publicly about her life, Lori never pretended that healing had been easy. She openly acknowledged that many of her experiences had been painful, frightening, and deeply unfair. Yet she also explained that those experiences had become part of the person she was. Rather than wishing they had never happened, she focused on using what she had learned to support others facing similar struggles. It was a perspective built over years of therapy, reflection, and personal growth. For Richard and Diane Poland, watching their daughter build that life became one of the greatest sources of pride they could imagine. They had watched a frightened 3-year-old disappear from their front yard without warning. They had lived through days of uncertainty, fearing they might never see her again. They had stood beside her through months of recovery and years of emotional healing. Now they were watching her become someone who devoted her life to helping others. As time passed, Lori eventually became a mother herself. The role gave her an entirely new perspective on what her own parents had endured during those 4 days in August 1983. She often spoke about the importance of protecting children and creating environments where they felt safe, supported, and valued. The experiences that once threatened to define her life instead became the foundation for the work she chose to do every day. Years after her rescue, Lori began working alongside Dr. Richard Krugman, the same pediatrician who had helped guide her recovery as a child. Together, they became involved with EndCAN, the End Child Abuse and Neglect Association, where they focused on preventing child abuse, supporting survivors, and improving education surrounding childhood trauma. For Lori, working beside one of the people who had helped save her life brought her story full circle. Her journey had begun in the darkness of an abandoned outhouse. Now, decades later, She was helping others find a way out of their own darkest moments. Chapter 7. A Voice Louder Than Silence. By the time Lori Poland reached adulthood, many people knew her as the little girl who had survived one of Colorado's most extraordinary child abduction cases. But Lori wanted to be known for something else. She wanted people to understand that surviving trauma was only the beginning. The real challenge was learning how to live afterward. After years of counseling and personal healing, Lori dedicated her career to helping children and families affected by abuse. She eventually established her own therapy practice and began working alongside Dr. Richard Krugman, the same pediatrician who had cared for her after she was rescued from the abandoned outhouse decades earlier. Together, they became involved with EndCAN, the End Child Abuse and Neglect Association, an organization focused on preventing child abuse, supporting survivors, and educating communities about trauma and recovery. For Lori, the partnership represented more than professional success. It brought her story full circle. The doctor who had once helped her find the words to describe her own experience was now working beside her to help other children find theirs. Through that work, Lori met hundreds of children, parents, and adults whose lives had also been shaped by abuse. Every family carried a different story, but many shared the same struggle, trying to understand how violence and trauma continue from one generation to the next. That experience gradually changed the way Lori viewed the broader issue of child abuse. She often explained that many offenders had once been victims themselves. Recognizing that pattern did not excuse criminal behavior, nor did it lessen the suffering of those they harmed. Instead, it highlighted the importance of early intervention, treatment, and support before cycles of abuse could continue into another generation. During her work with EndCAN, Lori frequently spoke about the need to understand these patterns if society hoped to prevent future victims rather than simply responding after tragedy had already occurred. The case of Robert Paul Thiret reflected that difficult reality. Investigators later learned that he had experienced abuse during his own childhood, beginning at around the same age Lori was when he kidnapped her. Lori never presented that fact as a justification for his crimes. Instead, she used it to illustrate a painful truth. Understanding how abuse affects people is not the same as excusing what they choose to do. Accountability and prevention, she believed, must exist together. Over the years, Lori was often asked whether she hated the man who had nearly taken her life. Her answers rarely focused on him. Instead, she spoke about healing. She believed that lasting change came from helping children before trauma shaped the rest of their lives. She encouraged communities to recognize abuse earlier, support families in crisis, and ensure that victims never felt forgotten or alone. Those ideas became the foundation of both her personal life and her professional work. Looking back, it is remarkable to consider how close the world came to never hearing Lori's story at all. Had Steve and Cynthia Golan chosen a different trail that afternoon? Had they ignored the faint cries coming from the abandoned outhouse? Or had they decided to continue driving instead of turning back? The outcome might have been very different. Instead, a series of seemingly ordinary decisions led them to a place where a 3-year-old girl had been waiting in complete darkness for nearly 4 days. Their actions saved her life. But survival was only the beginning of Lori's journey. The years that followed required a different kind of courage. The courage to confront painful memories, to rebuild trust, and eventually to dedicate her life to helping others heal from experiences similar to her own. Today, Lori's story is remembered not only because she survived an unimaginable crime, but because she refused to let that crime define who she would become. Rather than allowing fear to shape the rest of her life, she transformed her experience into a source of compassion for others who had suffered. Through her work, she has shown that recovery is possible, even after profound trauma, and that one person's survival can become a source of hope for countless others. Lori often reminds survivors that their voices are stronger than the silence that once surrounded them. It is a message shaped by her own life, a life that began with unimaginable suffering, but ultimately became one of resilience, service, and hope. For many people, she will always be remembered as the little girl rescued from the bottom of an abandoned outhouse. But for the children and families she has helped in the years since, she is remembered for something far greater. She is proof that while trauma can change a life forever, it does not have to decide how that life ends.